2 weeks before the biggest product launch of my life, someone leaked my unreleased designs to a competitor. A week after that, an anonymous account started messaging my business partners with lies designed to make them walk away. By the time my launch actually happened, half my orders had mysteriously canceled overnight. I knew almost immediately that it had to be someone close to me. Someone who knew details about my business that weren't public anywhere. It only took me a few days to narrow it down to 3 people, my 3 closest friends, the ones who'd been by my side since college, the ones I would have trusted with anything. I spent 2 weeks quietly suspecting the wrong 2 of them. The friend who actually did it was the last person I ever would have guessed. And by the time I figured it out, she'd already gotten close enough to nearly take everything. My name is Sophie. I'm 28, and 4 years ago I started a small skincare and candle business out of my apartment kitchen. Something that began as a hobby I posted about online and slowly, improbably, turned into an actual career. By the time this story starts, I had a small but genuinely loyal following, a rented studio space I'd finally been able to afford, and a product line I'd spent nearly a year developing that I believed, with the kind of hope that's almost embarrassing in hindsight, was going to be the thing that took the business to an entirely different level. I have 3 close friends I've kept since college: Riley, Jade, and Tasha. The 4 of us met freshman year, in the kind of accidental way friend groups sometimes form, and stayed close for a decade afterward, through breakups and job changes and, in my case, the slow, uncertain process of building a business from nothing. Riley runs her own small business too, a handmade jewelry line that's done reasonably well, though nowhere near the scale mine had started reaching over the past year. Jade works in finance, has always been the practical one of the group, someone who'd occasionally, gently questioned whether I was taking on too much risk with the business, the kind of concern that came from love, but sometimes landed as doubt. Tasha works in marketing for a mid-sized agency and had, over the years, become the person I leaned on most for advice about growing my brand. She understood the industry in ways the others didn't, and I trusted her instincts almost as much as my own. I want to say clearly, before anything else, I loved all 3 of them. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly, in the specific way you love people who've known you since you were 19 and uncertain about everything, who've watched you become whoever you eventually became. The product line I'd been developing, a relaunch of my core candle collection alongside a new skincare set I'd spent nearly a year formulating, represented the biggest financial and creative bet I'd ever made in the business. I'd taken out a small loan to fund the initial production run, secured a partnership with a boutique retailer that would carry the collection in 3 physical locations, and lined up a collaboration with a mid-sized influencer whose audience overlapped almost perfectly with mine. Everything about it felt, for the first time in years of slow, incremental growth, like it might actually be the moment that changed things. I'd shared details about the launch with all 3 of my friends over the preceding months, the way I always had draft designs, formulation notes, the retailer partnership, even the influencer collaboration before it was publicly announced, since none of it felt like information I needed to guard carefully among people I trusted completely. That trust is exactly what made everything that happened next so disorienting. The first sign that something was wrong came about 3 weeks before the launch date, when a mutual acquaintance sent me a screenshot that made my stomach drop the moment I opened it. A competing small brand, one I recognized vaguely from the same online spaces I existed in, though not one I'd ever considered a direct rival, had posted a preview of an upcoming candle collection. The label design, the color palette, even the specific scent names I'd spent weeks agonizing over, were unmistakably, unnervingly close to my own unreleased line. Close enough that it couldn't reasonably be coincidence, close enough that whoever created it had clearly seen my actual design files, not just guessed at a similar aesthetic from my public social media presence. I hadn't shared those specific design files publicly anywhere. I'd shared them, over the preceding months, exactly with the small circle of people closest to me, my 3 friends, my manufacturing partner, and a graphic designer I'd hired on a freelance basis for the project. I spent that first night convincing myself it had to be a coincidence, or possibly something that had leaked through my manufacturing partner rather than anyone closer to me. I reached out to my manufacturer the next morning. They were cooperative, professional, and ultimately convincing in explaining that nothing on their end had been shared externally, backed by their own internal file access logs, which they offered to show me without hesitation. That left a much smaller, much more uncomfortable circle of possibilities. 4 days later, things escalated in a way that made the design leak feel, in hindsight, almost like the smaller problem. The boutique retailer I'd partnered with for the launch called me, their tone careful and apologetic in a way that immediately put me on edge. They'd received an anonymous email, they explained, containing what the sender claimed were serious concerns about my business practices, allegations that I'd been sourcing ingredients from an unethical supplier, cutting corners on safety testing to save money, claims that, while completely false, were specific enough and detailed enough to sound at least superficially credible to someone without direct knowledge of my actual sourcing and testing process. I spent the better part of 2 days providing documentation to reassure the retailer supplier certifications, safety testing records, everything I needed to prove the claims were baseless. They ultimately stayed in the partnership, but the relationship, understandably, felt different afterward, more cautious, less warm than it had been before. The influencer collaboration fell apart entirely 3 days after that. She reached out to cancel, citing, vaguely at first, some things that had come to her attention that made her uncomfortable moving forward. When I pressed gently for specifics, she eventually forwarded me a message she'd received from an anonymous account details about a supposed pattern of late payments to contractors, unhappy former employees, specifics constructed carefully enough to sound plausible to someone without inside knowledge, and just vague enough that I couldn't immediately point to concrete proof disproving every individual claim, even though virtually all of it was either wildly exaggerated or outright fabricated. I sat in my studio that night, surrounded by the product line I'd spent a year building, and let myself fully absorb, for the first time, what was actually happening. Someone with real, detailed knowledge of my business knowledge that extended well beyond anything publicly visible was actively working to destroy the launch from multiple directions at once. Methodically, over a period of weeks, I made a list that night of everyone with access to the kind of information being used against me. It was a short list. Riley, Jade, Tasha, my manufacturing partner already cleared, and my freelance graphic designer, who I'd worked with for less than 4 months and had no real personal relationship with beyond the project itself. I want to be honest about how genuinely awful it felt to even write that list. To sit with the possibility that one of the 3 people I trusted most in the world might be the one doing this. I told myself, at first, it was more likely the designer, someone I knew far less well. Someone with less at stake emotionally in protecting me. I reached out to her, carefully, and quickly found evidence that put her fully in the clear. Her project files were time-stamped and version-controlled in a way that showed no external sharing. And her own social media history, going back months, showed no interaction whatsoever with the competing brand or the anonymous accounts involved. That left 3 names, people I'd known for a decade. I started quietly and with real discomfort, watching for anything unusual in each of them. Riley was the first person my suspicion landed on, for reasons that felt at the time disturbingly reasonable. Her own jewelry business had been growing more slowly than mine over the past year, and I remembered uncomfortably a few offhand comments she'd made months earlier about feeling like she was always a few steps behind in our friend group's various ventures. I noticed she'd been slightly harder to reach over the preceding weeks, canceling 2 of our usual coffee catch-ups with vague excuses. I hated myself for building a case against her in my head. But once I started looking, I couldn't stop finding small things that seemed to fit. I confided in Jade about my suspicions, since Jade had always been the most level-headed of the group, someone I trusted to help me think clearly rather than spiral. Jade listened carefully, then gently mentioned something that redirected my suspicion in an uncomfortable new direction. She'd noticed Tasha seeming unusually stressed lately, distracted during a recent group dinner, quick to change the subject whenever the launch came up. I hadn't noticed it myself, too absorbed in my own spiraling thoughts about Riley, but once Jade pointed it out, I couldn't stop noticing it either. For the better part of a week, I found myself quietly, uncomfortably suspicious of both of them at once, watching every interaction for confirmation, hating the person I was becoming in the process. Someone who scrutinized her closest friends for signs of betrayal instead of simply enjoying their company the way she used to. The truth about Riley came out almost by accident, in a conversation that left me feeling simultaneously relieved and deeply ashamed of where my mind had gone. She'd been distant, it turned out, because she'd been quietly planning a surprise for my upcoming birthday, coordinating with a few mutual friends on a small gathering, canceling our coffee catch-ups specifically to avoid accidentally letting something slip. When she found out gently that I genuinely suspected her of sabotaging my business, I watched real hurt cross her face. The specific kind of hurt that comes from realizing someone you love has been quietly building a case against you while you were planning something kind for them. I apologized as sincerely as I knew how. She forgave me. Eventually, though, something about that conversation stayed with both of us longer than either of us wanted to admit. That left Jade and Tasha, and here the story takes a turn I still find strange to fully explain. Even now, Jade, it turned out, had genuinely, if carelessly, contributed to one small piece of the problem she'd mentioned in a group chat with several mutual friends outside our core four, a rough outline of my launch timeline, not maliciously, simply as excited small talk about my upcoming collection. That group chat, it turned out, included someone loosely connected to the competing brand, a friend of a friend Jade hadn't thought twice about. It was carelessness, not malice, a real mistake. One Jade felt terrible about once she understood the connection, but not remotely the same thing as deliberate, sustained sabotage, which meant, as much as I didn't want to fully accept it, that the deeper, more calculated campaign, the leaked design files specific enough to require actual access to my private folders, the detailed false claims to my retailer and influencer partner that went well beyond anything Jade's group chat slip could explain, pointed towards someone else entirely. Tasha. I didn't want it to be Tasha. Of everyone in our group, she was the one I'd leaned on most over the years, specifically for business advice. The one who understood the industry. The one whose judgment I trusted almost as much as my own. The idea felt, even as the evidence quietly accumulated, almost impossible to hold in my mind alongside a decade of genuine friendship. I called a friend from outside our immediate circle, someone I'd met through a small business owners networking group, a woman named Priya, who happened to have a background in digital marketing and a sharper eye than I did for the kind of technical details that might actually prove something rather than just feeling suspicious. Priya walked me through what to look for. The anonymous emails sent to my retailer and influencer partner had been sent through an email service that, while designed to obscure the sender's identity from a casual glance, still left behind metadata that a careful, technically capable person could potentially trace, especially if the account had been set up carelessly rather than with genuine expertise in covering digital footprints. It took Priya less than 2 days to find something concrete. The anonymous account used to email my retailer had been created using a recovery phone number that, once cross-referenced against a data breach database from an unrelated service, Tasha had used years earlier under the same number, matched directly back to her. I sat with that confirmation for a long time before I let myself fully believe it, the way you sometimes need to stare at undeniable proof for an uncomfortably long stretch before your mind actually accepts what it's looking at. I still needed to understand why. Tasha had no competing business of her own. No obvious financial motive I could immediately identify the way I'd initially wrongly suspected with Riley. The why came together slowly. Over the following days, through a combination of careful observation and one conversation with Jade that reframed something I'd never thought twice about before. Jade mentioned, almost offhandedly, something from years earlier that suddenly felt significant in an entirely new light. Tasha had, back in college, briefly dated someone who later became genuinely important to me, not romantically significant to my current life, but professionally significant. Since that same person, years later, had become the private equity contact who'd helped connect me to the boutique retailer partnership that made this entire launch possible. Tasha, Jade recalled, had seemed strange about that connection when it first happened over a year ago, making a few comments at the time that Jade had brushed off as nothing, comments about how some people just get everything handed to them. I thought, too, about smaller things I'd never examined closely before, the way Tasha's advice over the years, while genuinely useful on the surface, had occasionally subtly steered me away from opportunities rather than toward them, moments I'd never questioned because I trusted her instincts completely. A partnership I'd once considered pursuing that she'd talked me out of, citing concerns that in hindsight seemed less about protecting me and more about slowing something down. A retailer connection she'd once discouraged me from following up on, one that, I later learned independently, had actually been a strong opportunity I'd missed entirely based on her advice. None of it, individually, would have meant anything on its own. Together, layered against a decade of quiet, carefully maintained resentment I'd never once suspected. It painted a picture of someone who had spent years positioning herself as my most trusted advisor while nursing something considerably darker. Underneath it, watching my business grow past the modest, manageable scale where it hadn't threatened anything, and deciding, once the launch made clear it was about to become something genuinely bigger, that she needed to actively stop it rather than simply watch it happen. I gathered everything Priya had found. The metadata trace, the account details, cross-referenced timestamps between Tasha's known whereabouts and the timing of each anonymous message, and sat with all of it for one final night before deciding exactly how I wanted to handle what I now knew with complete certainty. I decided against a private, one-on-one confrontation for reasons that felt important to me even in the middle of processing a betrayal this disorienting. A private conversation would give Tasha room to deny, to reframe, to work her considerable talent for persuasive communication against evidence that, while technically solid, still required some degree of trust in Priya's technical explanation to fully land. I wanted the truth to exist in a way she couldn't talk her way around. I also honestly wanted Riley and Jade there not for spectacle, but because they deserved to see, clearly and completely, exactly what had actually happened, especially after the uncomfortable, misplaced suspicion I'd carried toward both of them over the preceding weeks. I owed them that clarity as much as I owed myself. I organized what I framed, truthfully enough, as a low-key dinner at my apartment, the kind of casual gathering the four of us had done dozens of times over the years. Riley and Jade came in fully aware of what I'd found and why we were actually there. Tasha arrived with no idea anything had changed. I let the dinner proceed normally for the first 20 minutes or so, unable to fully explain even to myself why I needed that brief stretch of ordinary, familiar warmth before everything shifted, except that some part of me wanted one last honest look at the version of our friendship I'd believed in for a decade before I dismantled it entirely. Then I laid a folder on the table. I walked through everything methodically, the way Priya had helped me organize it, the leaked design files and the narrow circle of people with access to them, the anonymous emails to my retailer and influencer partner, the metadata trace connecting the account used to send them back to a recovery number tied directly to Tasha, the timeline showing each incident lining up precisely with moments. Tasha herself had known about the corresponding details, sometimes hours before they became relevant. I watched Tasha's face move through something I still find difficult to fully describe, not the confusion of someone falsely accused, but the specific, unmistakable stillness of someone watching a story they'd carefully constructed collapse in real time, with no path left to talk their way back out of it. "I don't know what you think you've found," she started, but the words came out thin, unconvincing even to her, I think. "I know exactly what I've found," I said. "I have the account creation details. I have the timing. I have a decade of small moments I never questioned because I trusted you completely. And I finally understand, watching them all together now, exactly what they actually were." She tried briefly to shift toward something closer to justification rather than denial. Something about feeling overlooked for years, about watching me build a life she felt she should have had a bigger part of, about the old college relationship Jade had reminded me of, resentment that had apparently calcified over years into something she'd eventually decided to act on rather than simply feel. Riley and Jade, sitting on either side of me, said very little throughout most of it, though I could feel both of them absorbing the full weight of what they were hearing, a betrayal that touched all three of us, in different ways all at once. I told Tasha, as calmly as I could manage given the circumstances, exactly what was going to happen next. I'd already, before that dinner, sent the full documentation, the metadata trace, the timeline, everything Priya had helped me compile to both my retailer partner and the influencer who'd canceled the collaboration, along with a clear explanation of what had actually happened and who was actually responsible. Both had responded already, hours before the dinner even started the retailer partnership, reassured, remained fully intact, and the influencer, genuinely apologetic once she understood the manipulation involved, agreed to move forward with the collaboration after all, on an even more visible scale than originally planned, partly I think out of her own discomfort at having nearly derailed something based on fabricated claims. I also told Tasha directly that I'd consulted with an attorney about the design theft specifically, since the competing brand's collection, built directly from my stolen files, represented a genuine legal exposure for everyone involved, including her, given the documented trail connecting back to her account. Whether that ultimately proceeded to a formal claim or not, I wanted her to understand clearly that the option, and the evidence to support it, existed and wasn't going away. She left that dinner within a few minutes of my finishing, without much more to say, the kind of silence that comes when someone finally understands there's no version of events left available to them that makes any of it sound survivable. The launch happened 2 weeks later than originally planned, delayed slightly to allow the influencer collaboration to be rebuilt properly and to give the retailer partnership time to fully stabilize after the earlier scare. It ended up, in the end, considerably more successful than I'd originally projected, partly because of the collaboration's larger scale, and partly, I think, because there's something about a business owner who's visibly, calmly handled a serious crisis that builds a specific kind of trust with customers who've been quietly watching the story unfold across social media. Even in the careful, general terms I chose to share publicly, without naming names or airing details that weren't mine alone to share. Tasha and I haven't spoken since that dinner. I've heard, through mutual connections neither Riley nor Jade actively maintain anymore, that she eventually left the marketing agency she'd worked at for years. Though I don't know the specifics, or whether it connected directly to what happened, I've made peace mostly with not knowing, and with not needing to know. Riley, Jade, and I are closer now than we've been in years. In the strange way that surviving something like this together, even something this painful, tends to strip away smaller, unspoken tensions that used to sit quietly underneath a friendship. I apologized again to Riley, more fully this time, for the suspicion I'd carried toward her, and she's told me more than once that she understood completely once she knew the full shape of what had actually been happening, that she couldn't blame me for looking hard at everyone. Once I realized how close and calculated the betrayal actually was, I think often about how easy it would have been to let my suspicion land permanently on the wrong person, how close I came to letting genuine, unwarranted doubt quietly damage a friendship that had done nothing to deserve it, while the actual person responsible continued, unbothered, exactly as she had been for years. I've learned something from that. I don't think I could have learned any other way that evidence matters more than instinct alone. That the person who seems most obviously guilty in the moment isn't always the one who actually is. And that the people who hurt you most quietly are often the ones who've spent the longest time making sure you'd never think to look their way. My business is doing better now than at any point before the launch, built now on a foundation I trust considerably more carefully than I used to, both in terms of who I let close to sensitive information, and in terms of how quickly I've learned to trust hard evidence over the comfortable, familiar assumption that the people who've known you longest are automatically the people who'd never hurt you. Some people, it turns out, can watch you build something for a decade, smile at you through all of it, and still quietly decide they'd rather see it fall apart than keep watching you succeed. If you sat through this whole story with me, thank you. I know this one had a lot of twists and turns, and I appreciate you staying until the very end to see who it actually was. This channel is built on stories exactly like this one: real betrayal, real suspense, real karma, and I post a brand new one every single day. So if this kept you guessing until the end, do me a favor and hit subscribe right now so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Drop a comment and let me know, did you suspect Tasha from the beginning? Or did she get you too? I read every single one. Hit subscribe, tap the bell so you catch tomorrow's story the second it drops. And I'll see you in the next one.